Moments after the Seahawks announced that they would be releasing Tyler Lockett, it's now looking likely that DK Metcalf will also not be on the Seahawks roster in 2025. How did we reach this point? Going to be breaking that all down here on a bonus edition of Locked On Seahawks.
You are Locked On Seahawks, your daily Seattle Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Greetings, 12. This is Corbin Smith, the host of the Locked On Seahawks podcast, your daily Seahawks podcast, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day. A special thanks to all the 12s who are tuning in, whether you're near the VMAC in Renton, Washington, or you're across the country in Boston, Massachusetts. Greatly appreciate each and every one of you tuning in, making Locked On Seahawks your first listen 5 days a week. It has been a crazy day in the Pacific Northwest, not just for the Seahawks, just sports in general. Tons of news, but the real bombshell coming moments after Tyler Lockett had been announced as released by the Seahawks, fellow receiver DK Metcalf reportedly demanding a trade. And I can tell you that this is not a report anymore. This has happened. There has been a trade demand that has been sent in from DK Metcalf and his camp. And if you've been following Locked On Seahawks, you've been following me on the Emerald City Spectrum, look, none of this should come as a surprise. And the way that this has unfolded here the last few weeks, leading up to the combine, John Schneider, the front office, had opened up some preliminary negotiations with DK Metcalf, who's got 1 year left on his current contract. And the two sides were pretty far apart in terms of what they were wanting. And DK Metcalf looking at that $30 million per year range to be a top 5 paid receiver. The Seahawks were not necessarily keen on the idea of paying that kind of money for a player who's been really good, but not exactly elite. If you look at the stats, Metcalf since 2019 when he came into the league, he's 18th in receptions. He is 12th in receiving yards. He is 5th in receiving touchdowns, but he hasn't been in the top 10 in those two categories, the main reception, receiving yard categories. And he's had 2 seasons. He hasn't gotten to the 1,000-yard mark. So Seattle's looking at him as a really good receiver, a top 10 caliber receiver, but is he top 5? Do we want to pay that kind of money? So, of course, these negotiations have been going on. And then last week, as I reported on Friday, John Schneider has not been actively shopping DK Metcalf, and I've made that very clear. He was not calling teams trying to move him, but he did answer the phone and talk to a couple of teams, the New England Patriots, a team that desperately need a top receiver for their young quarterback, Drake May. They were looking at Metcalf. There was not a deal there to be had. The pieces were not in place. The Patriots weren't going to trade their number 4 overall pick as part of a deal for Metcalf, and the Seahawks are not necessarily keen on any of their young receivers that they have. The Packers, on the other hand, the discussions got far enough where there was talk about compensation here. Romeo Doubs, Dontavian Wicks, the 2 young receivers that were being thrown out there as possibilities along with a high draft pick. Green Bay was wanting to go second rounder. The Seahawks, from my understanding, pick number 23 is what they wanted. And so nothing has happened on that front in terms of finalizing. But these are the steps that we've had up to this point. And now that there's been discussions, and again, it's not actively shopping him, but the fact that there had been discussions and DK Metcalf frustrated about where things are at with the negotiations for a new contract, wanting to play elsewhere. Now you've got this demand for a trade, and that doesn't necessarily mean that that's going to happen. We have seen examples where players, former Washington safety Budda Baker, for example, demanded a trade from the Arizona Cardinals and ended up getting a massive extension, and he's still playing in Arizona. But when you look at the way that this is played out, this feels like this is going to be a really tricky situation for the Seahawks to remedy this problem, because there's other issues at play here as well. The Seahawks were not happy that DK Metcalf's team put this out there today. When Tyler Lockett was released, this day was supposed to be about number 16, and now it isn't going to be, because DK Metcalf ends up getting back in the news here with this demand for a trade. The Seahawks as an organization were not happy about that leaking out. So now you've added that wrinkle to the equation. But really, when you look at the steps here, you've got the negotiations, the two sides not where they want to be, at least at this point, money-wise. And then John Schneider at least answers the phone. He's willing to talk with the Green Bay Packers and the New England Patriots. There's other teams in the periphery. And now you got the Seahawks giving Metcalf permission to seek a trade. Now, some may say, well, there's reports that he wants to go to a contender. Yeah, of course, every player wants to be on a contender. The Seahawks are a contender, though. They're a 10-win team. So that isn't necessarily the biggest thing here. Obviously, DK Metcalf's going to be wanting to push for that. But the Seahawks don't have to trade him to the Buffalo Bills or to the Kansas City Chiefs or one of these elite teams. They don't have to trade him to the Philadelphia Eagles to re-team up with A.J. Brown. They can send him to the Tennessee Titans if they want to, because DK Metcalf does not have a no-trade clause. This is not the same as Russell Wilson a few years ago, where Russell Wilson had the ability to dictate where he was going to be going because of that no-trade clause. DK Metcalf does not have that flexibility here. So this is kind of one of those be careful what you wish for type situations where if DK Metcalf thinks that there's greener pastures, be careful what you're wishing for. He's had a really good situation in Seattle. He's had two really good quarterbacks to throw the football to him. He's put up big numbers. And obviously there have been some things going on behind the scenes. And the Seahawks, from my understanding, and this ties into last week as well, they are not going to be just trading DK Metcalf to trade DK Metcalf. They don't have to deal him if they don't want to. If there's not a deal that they like, let's say that teams are lowballing them, third, fourth round pick. Well, Deebo Samuel went for a fifth. DK Metcalf will give a third or fourth. John Schneider is not going to pull the trigger for that type of a return. You could have a situation where DK Metcalf is still on the roster and is doing a hold-in at the beginning of training camp and not participating in the offseason program, and the Seahawks are letting that go on. And obviously you want to avoid those kind of distractions whenever you can. But this is a really good football player who's still in the prime of his career. John Schneider is not going to sell him for peanuts. It has not reached that point. They are going to be looking for the best deal they can get their hands on. If that comes from the Cleveland Browns, if it comes from the Jacksonville Jaguars, if it comes from the Tennessee Titans, then that's where they will trade him to. He does not have the leverage to be able to dictate where he's going to go. Now, if he reaches out to the Raiders, for example, and his former head coach Pete Carroll, and the Raiders come forward and say, you know what, we'll give you pick number 6 if you give us pick number 18. We'll do some pick swapping here. If they come to a deal like that is brought to the table, then maybe DK Metcalf can get traded to somewhere that he wants to be. But he does not have much leverage from that standpoint. John Schneider is the one that is in the driver's seat. So that's the situation that has now been brought upon both sides here. The Seahawks, maybe they're still trying to figure out how can we try to remedy this. DK Metcalf, has it reached a point where he's completely got both feet out the door and there's no going back? I'm getting the sense that that is where we are at this point. Just with the sequence of events that have happened, the dominoes that have fallen to this point, this feels like it's going to be really difficult to come back from. So let's assume that that's the case and that the Seahawks at this stage are not going to be able to get an extension. They're not going to be able to appease DK Metcalf, or both sides just reach the agreement. You know what? This isn't working anymore. We don't want to pay that price tag. You're looking elsewhere. Let's just cut ties. If that does end up being the case, as far as teams that stand out that could be potential fits, I'm still going to list the New England Patriots here. Again, they have the 4th overall pick. The Patriots are not going to be putting that pick out there for DK Metcalf. And that's why John Schneider didn't even continue the conversation last week with them. And the Seahawks do not like the receivers they have. Polk from Washington, you could bring him back to the Pacific Northwest, would probably be the best young receiver they could bring in. But the trade packages just are not what John Schneider is looking for to trade a player of this caliber. I think you have to go to the Los Angeles Chargers at pick number 22. That might be the most ideal trade partner at this stage for both parties, because Metcalf spends a lot of time in Southern California. Sanjay Lal is now with the Chargers. He was a Seahawks receivers coach, has a very close relationship with DK Metcalf. There's a lot of factors here that make that one interesting. And Quentin Johnston has had issues with drops. He has not been the player that the Chargers thought he was going to be. But this is a first-round pick that was a really good player at TCU at the college level. He's a bigger-bodied receiver that could win downfield. And the Seahawks, from my knowledge, they were high on him coming out of TCU. Maybe this is a case if a player has a change of scenery. I don't expect that he's going to be DK Metcalf. He hasn't been that caliber of player. but maybe a second-round pick in Johnston, you could get the deal done there. And then Green Bay, that's going to continue to be the team that to me looks to be the front runner here. The Packers want a true number one receiver. Now, Devontae Adams, they can sign without trading anybody, but Devontae Adams is now in the tail end of his career, and Adams wants to play with Aaron Rodgers still. Aaron Rodgers ain't going back to Green Bay. So there may not be a fit there. And the Packers do have a couple young receivers in Wicks and Dubs that the Seahawks liked in the pre-draft process. Maybe a second rounder and one of those guys gets it done. Maybe the Seahawks, if they have enough other offers, can get the Packers to wiggle a little bit and give them a first. Who knows? But Green Bay, to me, is a team that still has the best opportunity to create a package here that John Schneider would be interested in. And the two other teams that I have been told at least have been in the periphery, and I think there will be other teams now sniffing around now that this has gone public, that Metcalf is requesting a trade. Buffalo and Kansas City, the two elite teams in the AFC. Buffalo is potentially going to lose Amari Cooper, who they traded for. He's a free agent. Maybe you can swing a deal with Buffalo for one of their young receivers. They did just extend Khalil Shakir, so I don't see them moving on from him. Can you get him to move Coleman, your first-round pick that you had last year? I don't know if that's going to be doable, but Buffalo is certainly a team that could have some interest because they are clearly in their title window. And in Kansas City, the Chiefs at pick number 31, Kansas City has sniffed around with DK Metcalf before. This is not the first time that they would be trying to get him to play with Patrick Mahomes. Kansas City is a team to keep a close eye on as well. The young receivers, though, you're not going to be getting Worthy. They're not trading him away. Sky Moore's battled injuries, has not played at the level they thought. Sky Moore, to me, is probably the one receiver that would stand out there, but he's got 1 year left in his contract. So that impacts negotiations. And, of course, there could be other teams here. Again, the Raiders, as I mentioned, with the Pete Carroll connection, that would make a lot of sense. And I'm sure there are other teams that I could mention that are in the teens. You know, maybe Pittsburgh wants to team him up with George Pickens. I mean, there are other teams out there that I definitely could see having interest now that this is clearly a public issue when the DK Metcalf is saying, I want to play elsewhere. But those would be the 5 teams, at least based on what I've heard, the things that we do know that would make the most sense right now. And maybe Seattle plays hardball here and calls Metcalf's bluff. Maybe he ends up being on the roster in 2025. Who knows? But right now, I feel like this is a situation that's going to be difficult for them to fix, just the way that things have gone. And the Seahawks, again, they're not happy about the fact that this came out today with Tyler Lockett. They purposely announced his release separate from the other players that they cut because this was supposed to be about him. It's supposed to be celebrating an iconic Seahawk and his own teammate, his own receiver teammate, and his agency. They leaked this. And it really ruins what should have been all about Tyler Lockett. And so that may be something that the Seahawks are going to be sour about for quite some time with how respected Tyler Lockett is. There's a lot of different things at play here, but this is going to be fascinating to watch. It's certainly not going to be the first time we're going to be talking about this in coming weeks because there's going to be teams that crop up that are interested. Maybe Green Bay re-rises here. But this is going to be an intriguing storyline, one of the biggest storylines to watch heading towards free agency and the draft in the NFL. As always, you can follow me on X and Blue Sky at Corbin Smith NFL. Make sure to subscribe to Locked On Seahawks on YouTube and wherever you get your podcast to make sure you don't miss a single episode. We will have our full Wednesday show coming later today. I'll be rejoined by Rob Rang, and we are going to be commemorating the entire episode to the legend that is Tyler Lockett. We're going to look back at some of his best plays, what made him such an icon in the Pacific Northwest. It's going to be a full Tyler Lockett show. Make sure that you are listening in. We can't wait. And enjoy the rest of your Wednesday. Go Hawks.